Remember the exact moment the table went silent. My boyfriend's father, a man who had spent 30 years as a commercial airline captain and another 5 telling anyone who would listen exactly what was wrong with the aviation industry, had just finished explaining to me why women made poor decision-makers under pressure. He said it the way people say things they've believed for so long they've stopped questioning them, conversationally, casually, like he was talking about the weather. He had a glass of sweet tea in one hand and a bread roll in the other, and he looked at me across the dinner table with the patient expression of someone doing a favor. My boyfriend shifted in his seat beside me. His mother went very still at her end of the table. And I set down my fork, folded my hands in my lap, and said, quietly, "I actually fly for a living. I'm a first officer on the 737, your son's airline." Nobody moved. His father stared at me for a long moment, and then the color in his face changed in a way I won't forget for a long time. But to understand how we got there, how a Sunday pot roast dinner in suburban Ohio turned into the most awkward professional revelation of that man's life, you have to go back about 3 weeks. I had just transferred to the Columbus base after 2 years flying out of Denver. New city, new crew scheduling, new commute. I was 31 years old. 8 years into my career, and still in that phase of life where the job feels like something you have to protect a little. Keep separate from the parts of yourself that are just a person trying to figure things out. Flying was mine. When I wasn't in uniform, I liked being just a person. My boyfriend, who I'd been with for almost 2 years, understood that without me having to explain it much. We met at a coffee shop. He'd asked what I did. I told him. He said, "That's incredible," and then asked about my coffee order, and I liked him immediately for not turning the whole conversation into an interview about cockpits. He worked in software sales, traveled a lot himself, and we had fallen into the easy rhythm of 2 people who knew how to be independent and still choose each other. About a week after I landed the Columbus transfer, he came over with takeout Thai and that slightly careful expression he gets when he's about to bring something up. We were eating on the couch when he said, "My parents want to meet you." "That sounds good," I said, reaching for the spring rolls. He nodded, but didn't say anything else right away. I glanced at him. "There's something I should probably tell you first." I put down the spring roll. My dad retired from flying about 5 years ago, 30 years as a captain, mostly international routes. He paused. He's really proud of that. Like, it's his whole identity at this point. "Okay," I said slowly. "And?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "He's also got some pretty fixed opinions about women in the cockpit." I looked at him. "I know," he said quickly. "He's not a bad person. He's just from a different era, and he's never really updated that particular view." "What does he think I do?" I asked. He winced. "I might have told him you work in aviation, on the ground side, scheduling." I stared at him for a second. "You told your father I work in scheduling." I panicked. For 2 years? The subject just it kept not coming up naturally, and then it had been so long that bringing it up felt weird, and He stopped. "I handled it badly. I know." I sat back against the couch cushions and thought about that. 2 years of him knowing exactly what I did, being proud of it when it came up with his friends, driving me to the airport at 5 in the morning without complaint. And at some point he had made a quiet decision to edit that part of my life out of the story he told his father. "Why?" I asked. Not angry yet, just genuinely wanting to understand. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I knew the second he found out, he'd make the whole dinner about your credentials. And I wanted him to meet you first." That answer was honest enough that I let myself sit with it. I understood the impulse. I'd spent 8 years being introduced as the female pilot in rooms where that was still considered a talking point. There was something appealing about walking into a house as just a person for once, without the credential arriving ahead of me. "All right," I said finally. He blinked. "All right? I'll come to dinner, but I'm not lying if he asks me directly." "No, of course not." He exhaled. "He probably won't even bring it up much. He mostly talks about his own flying." I smiled a little at that. That sounds about right. What I didn't know yet was how much his father could talk about his own flying, or how specifically he would choose to make his point. The drive out took about 40 minutes on a Sunday afternoon. His parents lived in a quiet suburb west of the city. Older neighborhood, big oaks lining the street, the kind of houses with American flags on the porch and bird feeders in the front yard. Tidy and settled. He was quiet for most of the drive, hands at 10 and 2. "You're nervous," I said. "A little. Is he going to be rude or just opinionated?" He thought about it. Opinionated, he doesn't mean to be rude. He just has a very loud internal monologue that sometimes becomes an external monologue. I laughed. "Okay. He's going to like you," he said. "He likes people who are direct." Good. He might just also say some things that... "I've been in crew briefings with captains who thought I was the flight attendant," I said. "I can handle dinner." He gave me a look that was somewhere between grateful and slightly worried. Right. His parents' house was at the end of a cul-de-sac with a paved driveway and a basketball hoop that had clearly been there since the 90s. His mother met us at the door before we even knocked. Small woman, warm eyes, the kind of smile that reaches immediately. She pulled her son into a hug and then turned to me with both hands extended. "Finally," she said, "he's been stalling on this for months." "Mom, it's true." She squeezed my hands. Come in, dinner's almost ready." The house smelled like pot roast and fresh bread. She had a talent for making a space feel like you'd been there before. The living room had family photos on every wall, a console table lined with small ceramic animals, a decades-old recliner that clearly belonged to one person. His father appeared from the hallway. He was a big man. Tall, broad, the kind of retired pilot build that suggests someone who spent decades being physically authoritative in small spaces. Silver hair, close-cropped. He moved like someone used to being in charge of rooms. "There he is," his father said, gripping his son's hand and pulling him into a brief, firm hug. Then he turned to me. "This is her," his son said. His father looked me over in the quick, assessing way that I recognized from pre-flight checks, methodical, top to bottom, forming a conclusion. He extended his hand. "Good to finally meet you." His name was Gord, short for Gordon, which I learned later he preferred only his wife used. "You too," I said. "I've heard a lot. Good things, I hope." He said it like someone who expected the answer to be yes. His mother steered us all toward the dining room. There was a centerpiece of autumn leaves on the table, cloth napkins, a gravy boat that had probably been used every Sunday for 20 years. I liked it. The whole house felt like someone had actually lived there, not just furnished it. Gord sat at the head of the table. His son sat beside me. His mother kept moving in and out of the kitchen, waving off every offer of help. The first 20 minutes were easy. He asked about Columbus, what neighborhood I lived in. His mother asked how I'd met her son. Gord talked about a golf tournament he played in the month before, and the conversation moved around comfortably. Then his mother said she'd heard I worked in aviation, and Gord's attention shifted. "Groundside?" he asked. "Mostly operations," I said, which was technically true. He nodded, taking a bite of pot roast. "That's good work. People don't realize how much of the operation lives on the ground." He paused. "Though it's a different world from actually being up there." "It is," I said. His son reached for the breadbasket. "Flew international for 22 years, Gord continued. "Europe, Asia, South America. You get a feel for aviation that you can't learn from a schedule board." "I believe that," I said. He seemed to appreciate the lack of argument. It encouraged him. Over the next half hour, the conversation drifted in and out of flying the way it does when someone in the room has 30 years they want to account for. His mother redirected twice. His son changed the subject once. But Gord had something on his mind that night, and he kept returning to it. At one point, he said, "The thing people outside the cockpit don't understand is the weight of it. Command isn't a title, it's a physical thing. You feel it in your chest every time you push back from the gate." "That makes sense," I said. He looked at me with the approving expression of a teacher whose student has given the right one-word answer. "You need a certain temperament. Not everyone has it." His son looked at his plate. "Pressure reveals character," Gord continued. "Always has, always will. And in my experience..." He paused, turning his glass slowly on the tablecloth. There are some people who find that seat natural, and some who are always working a little harder to belong in it. His mother said his name gently. I'm not saying anything offensive, he said. I'm making a point about aptitude. I took a sip of water. He looked at me again. You follow what I mean? I think so, I said. Good. He sat back. Because the aviation world has changed a lot in the last 20 years, and not all the changes have been. He seemed to search for the word, improvements. Dad, his son said quietly, I'm speaking generally. You're not, though. Gord waved his hand. I'm talking about standards, hiring pipelines, the push to fill seats based on factors that have nothing to do with who should be in that seat. There was a short silence. His mother set down her fork carefully, and Gord, apparently feeling he had built up sufficient context, looked at me and said, no offense meant to anyone personally, but the cockpit is not the place to make social statements. The people up front have 200 lives depending on them, and that has always demanded the best, not the most representative. His son closed his eyes for just a second. I set my napkin on the table. I had heard versions of this speech before. In break rooms, in crew lounges, once, memorably, from a captain who didn't know I was sitting behind him on a deadhead flight and who turned red in a very specific way when he finally noticed my epaulets. So I wasn't angry. I was something more measured than that. I waited until Gord had finished his thought until he had picked up his fork again and taken a satisfied sip of sweet tea. Then I said, You're right that the seat demands the best. He nodded. I've tried to earn that every day I've been flying. Gord looked at me with the patient expression of someone waiting for the point. 8 years, I said. Mostly regional, the last 3 on the 737. I paused. First officer on the Columbus base, which I think is actually your son's airline. The table went very quiet. Gord put down his fork. His son had gone completely still beside me. His mother looked between the two of us with wide, careful eyes. Gord's expression moved through several things in quick succession. Skepticism first, then the specific recalibration that happens when a person's internal model fails to match what's in front of them. He studied my face like he was looking for the tell that meant I was exaggerating. You're a pilot, he said. First officer? Yes. On the line? Active? Yes. On the line? Active? Yes. I flew Thursday. He was quiet for a moment. 737, 800. Another silence. His mother inhaled quietly. His son was staring at the tablecloth. Gord leaned back in his chair, and for the first time in the 2 hours I had been sitting across from him, the authority left his posture. He didn't slump. He was too much a product of 30 years of professionalism for that. But something went out of him. I see, he said. Nobody reached for their food. Gord looked at his son. You didn't mention this. No. His son met his father's eyes. I should have. You should have. Gord nodded slowly and then turned back to me. And you just let me. I wanted to meet you as your son's girlfriend first, I said, not as a credential. He absorbed that. I could see it landing in the way honest things do, not cleanly, but with weight. His mother let out a breath she'd apparently been holding for several minutes. Well, she said, in the quiet voice of someone who has had decades of practice navigating this particular current. That certainly changes some context. Gord rubbed his jaw once. He looked at the table. He looked at me. And then he said something I hadn't expected. The regional pipeline, he said slowly. That's a hard route. Long hours, low pay for the first few years. It is, I said. You did regionals before the 7337. 5 years. He nodded once, the nod of a person doing private math. What's your total time? About 4,200 hours. He was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing. No, I said. It isn't. His mother asked if anyone wanted more pot roast. Nobody moved immediately, so she stood up and started filling plates anyway, which was probably the kindest thing anyone could have done in that moment. Gord ate for a while without saying much. His son made one attempt at a different topic, something about a baseball team, and it didn't really take. Eventually, Gord set down his fork and said, I owe you an apology. I looked at him. What I said about the cockpit, he said. He wasn't looking for permission to continue, just organizing his thoughts in the deliberate way of someone who doesn't apologize often and wants to do it right. I made assumptions about what kind of people belong in that seat. He glanced at his son briefly, and I said them out loud in your direction, which was, he paused, not my best moment. People have strong opinions about flying, I said. They do, and mine were formed a long time ago and I haven't examined them as much as I should have. He met my eyes. That's on me. His mother touched his arm once, briefly. His son let out a breath. I said, I appreciate that. Gord nodded. He picked up his tea. 4,200 hours, he said, half to himself. At 31? 31. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, more like someone adjusting a frame that had been hanging slightly crooked for a long time. After dinner, his son went inside to help his mother with the dishes. Gord and I ended up on the back porch. The October air had a clean, cold edge to it, and somewhere up the street someone was burning leaves. That particular fall smell that belongs to the Midwest in a way I've never been able to place exactly. We stood at the railing for a while without talking. Then he said, How long has my son known? Since the beginning. Gord gave a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh. I'd have done the same thing, I think. I've always been. He stopped. My wife says I have a tendency to fill rooms. You're hard to interrupt, I said. He smiled at that, a little reluctantly. That's a diplomatic way to put it. He was quiet for a moment. My daughter-in-law, my older son's wife, she tried to have a conversation with me about this a couple years ago. About the way I talk about women in aviation. He paused. I didn't listen very well. What changed tonight? He thought about it. You didn't argue with me. I waited. Most people either agree with me to keep the peace, or they push back and it turns into a thing. He looked at the yard. You just waited. Like you already knew how the conversation was going to end. He glanced at me. Did you? I had a general idea, I said. He laughed, more genuinely this time. I imagine you've sat across from a lot of men like me. In a lot of different settings. He nodded slowly. That's a lot of patience to have to carry. You'd get used to it. He turned toward me slightly. You shouldn't have to, though. That's the part I didn't let myself think about much. He looked back at the yard, took someone sitting quietly through my speech, and then calmly telling me she flies my son's airline to make it feel real. I didn't say anything. The core of what I believe hasn't changed, he said carefully. The seat demands the best. I still think that. He paused. I just had a very narrow idea of what the best could look like. The porch light came on automatically above us. Thank you for not leaving, he said. Your son made a good pot roast. He laughed at that, a real one, and some of the tension that had been in his shoulders since the reveal finally eased. The back door opened and his son leaned out. You two okay? We're talking, his father said. Good talking, his father said. Good talking or good talking, I said. His son looked between us once and then said he put coffee on and went back inside. Gord was quiet for another minute. Then he said, Can I ask you something? Sure. What made you want to fly? And I told him. Not the short version I give at dinner parties. The real one. The first time I sat in a Cessna at 17, the way my stomach dropped when the wheels left the runway, the 4 years of working 2 jobs to pay for flight school, the first solo, the first IFR approach in actual conditions. The day the regional offered me a seat and I called my mother from a parking lot and cried. He listened. He asked questions, good ones, specific ones, the questions of someone who understood what the details meant. By the time we went back inside, the coffee was ready and his mother had set out a plate of cookies she'd apparently had waiting. We sat at the kitchen table and talked for another hour. Gord mostly listened, which his son later told me was extremely unusual. When we left, his father walked us out to the car. He shook his son's hand, then he turned to me. I'd like to hear more about the Denver route sometime, he said. If you're willing. Anytime, I said. He nodded once. Dried safe. On the way home, my boyfriend was quiet for the first stretch of highway. Then he said, "I'm sorry for not telling him. You were trying to protect something." I was trying to protect something. I was trying to protect myself from an uncomfortable conversation. He glanced over. "That's not the same thing." "No," I said, "but you knew it eventually. That counts for something." He was quiet again. Then, he liked you. He respected the hours. He asked you about Denver. He doesn't ask people things. I looked out at the highway lights. "He's not a bad man," I said. He just had a picture in his head that didn't match what was in front of him. It takes something real to shake that loose. "You were very patient." I thought about that word. Patient. I had heard it a lot over the years. Usually as a compliment, but occasionally as something else. A way of saying that I had been quiet when maybe I should have been louder. I was still sorting out which one it was. "I've learned," I said, "that the people who need the most convincing usually aren't moved by arguments. They're moved by evidence. You just have to be willing to be the evidence." He reached over and took my hand. We drove the rest of the way home with the radio low. 3 Sundays later, his father called me. I was doing laundry when my phone rang with a number I didn't immediately recognize. When he said his name, I sat down on the edge of the bed. He said he'd been talking to someone in his retired pilots group, a woman who had flown 747s internationally in the 90s and had stories he admitted he'd mostly dismissed at the time. He said he'd listened differently this time. He said he'd listened differently this time. He said it had been uncomfortable in the specific way that useful things sometimes are. Then he said, "I was hoping you might consider coming back for dinner, just to give me a chance to start things right." I said yes. The second dinner was the same pot roast, same tablecloth, same gravy boat. His mother had made a pie this time, apple, which she set in the middle of the table like a small declaration of optimism. Gord stood up when I came in. That was new. We sat down and he looked at his plate for a moment, and then he looked at me and said, "I want to say something before we get started." Nobody moved. "I spent 30 years in a cockpit," he said. "I'm proud of that, but I also spent 30 years deciding I already knew how things worked, and I stopped checking that assumption as often as I should have." He folded his hands on the table. "What I said the first time you were here, about who belongs in the seat, I said it without thinking about who was in the room. That was careless. And it was wrong." His son sat very still. His mother looked at him with the expression of someone watching a thing she has hoped for a long time. Gord looked at me. "You earned your hours the same way I did. No shortcuts, no asterisks." I nodded once. "And my son is lucky," he added more quietly. "That's what I actually meant to say first." His son cleared his throat. His mother made a small sound and pressed her fingers to the corner of her eye and immediately pretended she hadn't. I said, "Thank you, Gord." He picked up his fork. "Now, tell me about the Columbus weather patterns in winter. I always thought the lake effect was underrated as a training challenge. And we talked about flying for 2 hours. Not the version of flying he'd been narrating all his life, where the sky belonged to people who looked like him, where the seat was a reward for a certain kind of person. Just flying, the thing itself. The weight of it, the beauty of it, the way it gets into you when you're 17 and doesn't come out." He asked good questions. I gave real answers. And somewhere in the middle of apple pie, I noticed him listening with the same quality of attention he'd used for decades in a cockpit. The kind that happens when someone has decided that what's coming in matters more than what they already think they know. That's the thing about people who have spent their whole lives caring deeply about something real. When you finally speak their language fluently enough, they hear you. It just sometimes takes a moment for them to realize you were speaking it all along. I've thought a lot about that second dinner. The apple pie, the same tablecloth, Gord standing up when I walked in. Such a small thing. But I noticed it. What I keep coming back to isn't the first dinner, the lecture, the assumptions, all of it. That part I've lived through versions of before. What stays with me is what happened after, because what Gord did took something real. He made a phone call he didn't have to make. He sat with his own discomfort long enough to let it change something. That's not easy for anyone. and it's especially hard for people who've spent decades being the most experienced person in the room. I've known people who were shown the same thing. He was shown and never moved an inch, who found a way to reframe it, dismiss it, file it away somewhere so the picture they already had didn't have to change. Gord do that, and I think the reason he didn't, the reason it landed, is because somewhere underneath all the certainty, there was still a person who actually cared about getting things right. That's a form of integrity. It's quiet and it's not always visible, but it's there, and it's what makes change possible. I spent 8 years building the hours, the ratings, the judgment that comes from doing something hard in real conditions over and over until it becomes part of how you think. That didn't happen because flying was easy or because anyone handed me a shortcut. It happened because I kept showing up, kept learning, kept choosing the thing I wanted over the easier version of my life. There were years when I was exhausted and underpaid and sitting in a regional cockpit at 2 in the morning wondering if any of it was going to add up to something. It added up. It always does, if you keep going. Not in a tidy, predictable way, but it adds up. And the patience that Gord noticed, the part where I sat through his speech without arguing, that wasn't strategy. It wasn't a tactic I'd planned on the drive over. It came from understanding, after enough time in enough rooms, that you can't argue someone out of a belief they didn't argue themselves into. You can only show them something true and then give them enough space to see it. That requires a kind of self-possession that I had to develop the hard way, through a lot of moments where I didn't handle it that well and had to learn from that too. What I hope anyone takes from this is simple. The way you carry yourself when someone underestimates you, the quality of your character in that moment, matters more than whether you win the argument. Gord didn't change because I corrected him. He changed because I showed him something real and then let him be a person about it. The outcome wasn't mine to control. It was his to choose. He chose well in the end. And that's worth something. Maybe that's worth everything.